I want to welcome you. I'm Lee Erickson. I will be the host for today. This is our fall speaker series all about breaking in. We'll have a series of speakers on different aspects of breaking in. Quick reminder that these sessions are recorded and we will be posting them to our YouTube channel. There will be time to ask questions at the end. So if you want to ask a question, just stick it in the Q&A box at any time. All right, so today our topic is breaking in as a student, recommendations on how do you take your idea from concept to viable business while in school. And we are very happy to have Joe Kitonga as our guest today. Joe is currently a senior in computer engineering at Penn State. As a student, he started a number of different companies, had a lot of different ideas that he worked through. He's currently the founder and CEO of Vitable Health. Vitable provides affordable primary and urgent care coverage through a network of providers, and he's really working to reduce the cost of emergency rooms and urgent care by providing these in-home visits. So welcome, Joe. Glad to have you.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
So before we get started on your top 5, tell us how you came up with the idea for Vitable.
Yeah, so I grew up working at my parents. So I moved from Kenya to the U.S. when I was 13, and I grew up working at my parents' home health company that they started soon after. And we had this workforce of $10 per hour employees who, once we hit 50 employees, we were required to offer them health insurance, which we did, but only a small fraction, 15% would opt in, with the far majority being uninsured, where they'd overutilize the emergency room for common ailments, where 70% of visits are unnecessary, costing upwards of $2,000 per month, which was more than their monthly salary. And Vitable was really created to give them coverage for those everyday ailments. So that's what kind of led me here.
Okay, awesome. Well, we'll get to talk a little bit more about it as we go. So let's jump into your recommendations. Your first recommendation was start now. So talk a little bit about why it's so important to get started early, and what are some of the things that you recommend students might do to get started?
Right, that's a great question. And I think it's one where throughout my college career, it was, I've had friends that have tried to start companies alongside of it. And sometimes I'd overthink the projects that I wanted to build. How much money would I need? Would I be able to pull it off? And all those questions that I'd constantly ask myself would just delay the process of me learning. Because what I'd initially start working on would often change. And even with Vitable, what we started doing is not necessarily what we're doing now. So the act of starting itself, you start this process, this learning process, and each step that you make towards whatever it is, whether it's building that product or launching that product, the faster you are able to do it is the faster you can learn. And you don't really need much to get started. I think what I've if take away from the different projects I worked on throughout my college career, I needed less than I thought I needed, and I could get more done with less. I didn't necessarily have a team for many of the projects that I started with, but when I start building and I start just making incremental progress, people would be attracted to that progress and eventually join me, whether that was 6 months later or a year later. But as long as I kept moving and kept making progress, I'd be able to attract teammates. In addition to that, at least with Vitable now, we did need some money to get started, but I just used up my Microsoft internship savings, as well as different grant programs at Penn State that I was lucky to be a part of and benefit from. But I didn't need hundreds of thousands of dollars to get started. And whatever it is that I needed, I could sort of find alternative ways to get around it. And over time, you get more progress. People will want to join you because they've seen that you can execute and de-risk the business quite a bit.
So talk a little bit about some of the 1 or 2 things you think, you've talked about just doing it and not worrying about the financial side of it, at least in the beginning. What are some of the things that you think students at Penn State or any university should be doing or taking advantage of right away?
I think the first one is just being able to build the product that you have in mind. I was lucky enough to be, when I initially came to Penn State, I was a physics and electrical engineering double major. I knew how to code because my brother, forced me to learn when I was in high school, but I never knew how to actually build and ship product, an end-to-end product. So when I first had, I was working on What's Poppin', this just event idea, which every college student probably, thinks of. I had two options. It's either I could have found someone who knew how to build an end-to-end product, or I could have built it myself. I chose to do the latter, primarily because I was doing research at the Millennium Science Complex over the summer, and I had a bunch of free time and no friends. But I think it could have been very easily switched in to become, I need to find someone to help me build this product. And it would have delayed, my ability to actually launch the product and start to learn and iterate. So just, at least one is that building. Just if you are an engineer or have an engineering background, it is to build. But with Vitable, I didn't, in the initial days, I actually found, I built a network of engineers, at Penn State, and I found the best people that I wanted, I would have loved to work with, and I had them join my team early on. So I think, if you can build, you should learn to build, or you should really build friendships with people who can build, because the building part is what often delays, people from launching. But you don't need much to build, and you can use no-code tools to really bootstrap that initial product and start learning.
Yep. Which brings us to your second one, which is kind of tied in: fail and iterate fast, right? So the word fail has a lot of negative connotations. So tell us what you mean by fail, and maybe you can share a fail story that you particularly like, either for yourself or somebody else.
Yeah, I'll focus in on Vitable now. In the early, when the initial idea for Vitable was this Uber for healthcare model, we'd utilize this, idle network of nurse practitioners who work 3 to 4 days, 12-hour shifts, and they have this time that, they'd like to supplement their income. And on the other side, it was a fee for service model where you pay us $79 for each visit. So I'd spent 7 months when I initially thinking through the idea, I wanted to hire them outright and set up this physical clinic. But it was really difficult. I didn't have the money to do it, and nurse practitioners didn't necessarily want to work for me. And I emailed all the professors in the health policy administration, HPA college, the law professors that focused in on healthcare, and a bunch of professors in college of nursing. And they very quickly learned that that was just not going to be possible, especially for because of corporate practice of medicine laws and the cash that would be needed. And we decided to move towards an independent contractor model, which, we pay them per visit. But, so spend 7 months figuring that out. We finally get the structure in place. We launch, we get a Google Maps entry, Vitable urgent care, we come to you. And we get no visits for the first 3 days. So it's like we built up 7 months to this, no visits at all. And it was pretty, devastating, but we got, over the next 10 days, we had maybe 7 visits, and it was great, but it was really hard to match up supply and demand. We'd get visits the 1 hour, we'd get 3 visits the 1 hour where we had no provider on call. So, over that first few months of launching, we quickly switched over to a subscription service, still targeting individuals, because it was, we thought, or we believed, that if people were paying us the subscription fee, when they did get sick, they'd use us, and we didn't necessarily need to remind them that we existed, which in that fee-for-service model we did. We switched that. It didn't quite work well. I got a kiosk at the mall, and I was selling, healthcare subscriptions to people who were shopping and so forth. And the people that signed up were not who we were expecting. We thought the wealthy shoppers would sign up for this concierge service, but the people that were signing up were those everyday workers, the people that were, helping take care of the mall or working at the mall. And that was quite interesting. So we switched the persona that we were targeting, but it was very difficult because I built up this hypothesis of who the target perfect person was and how sexy the idea would be if we were this, high-end benefit. But we quickly learned that the people that really needed our service were these everyday workers.
Well, and that just emphasizes you've got to get out and have contact with your customer, right? Which is one of the things we preach down at the LaunchBox, right? Because you don't know, you're making assumptions. So that's really interesting. So your original premise that was the in-house or the I will come to you concierge part was the value. You have found, no, actually the value was the affordability in terms of supplementing what people had. So, and you never would have, like you said, you never would have learned that had you not actually interacted with them.
Right. If we'd never launched, or if we'd never we didn't have many customers in those early days.
Right.
It was figuring out, and this reminded me of when I was part of the LaunchBox, always asking those asking why and really understanding why our members were signing up for our service was key. And even that when we've narrowed in on those everyday people, a month later, 2 months later, they all, like 90% of them churned. Because they were paying via credit card and they'd either get fired, lose it, or laid off, or run out of money on their credit cards. And so it was really difficult for us to keep them enrolled for reasons unrelated to them needing or wanting the coverage, right?
Right.
But the last iteration, or one of the most important iterations we had, was switching to focus on employers, and that was a huge learning curve as well, and it's something that we're continuing to learn through. But yes.
Yeah. So that again, and it's interesting because I didn't know how this was going to go, but it leads me into your third one, which is don't quit. Right? We've all heard about persistence. It's clear that you were very persistent in this idea, right? So when you had time, did you ever have times when you thought about quitting? And if so, what did you do to keep your motivation up? If not, why do you think you didn't hit that wall?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked on Vitable now for it's getting closer to 2 years. And all there were months that went by, and I was very, things just weren't working out. We weren't growing. People were quitting, and it was very painful. We couldn't necessarily see the other side. And I think just pushing through those moments and just surviving long enough to get lucky was one of the things that was constantly in my head. I'd read it maybe on a fortune cookie, but we just consistently tried to, we hit break even pretty fast. We knew I didn't have a network to raise money, so I had to be, really cash efficient, and we hit break even very fast. I was living in my parents. I had no, extravagant expenditure. So once we hit $1,000 in monthly revenue, we weren't growing at all, but it covered all the costs for our service. And we had time to breathe and figure it out. We essentially had infinite runway. We could take 10 years and maybe we don't grow much, but at least we won't die as long as we don't quit. And having that control was extremely important to me. So even in those moments where it was, when I wasn't necessarily confident that we'd figure it out, I just believed that if we continued to run these experiments, we continued to talk to our existing members and learn why they were sticking around, because we had people that were sticking around. It was just, how can we find more of them? And that was always the North Star. But I think, it's always, for me, it was those painful moments were very painful. But I'm glad
and it's back into iterating and learning and getting out, because when you don't, you have the illusion of progress, right? But when you do, you actually can see that you're making progress. So let's talk a little about customers. Your fourth recommendation is obsess over each customer. So I really like this one. So why do you think it's critical, and what are some of the things that you've done at Vitable to act on this obsession with your customers?
Yeah, I mean, even in when we first launched, when we were still the Uber for healthcare, we had 7 patients over the first, 10 or 15 days. Not many, but each one we wanted to know, why did you choose? Because they called the Vitable urgent care listing, and I'd have to convince them to let us come to their home. So it wasn't that they were expecting that we were in-home service. I had to convince them to let us come in. And it was this weird guy on the phone that they just called, and and they pay ahead of time over the phone. They give me their credit card, and you know, it's not it wasn't a great experience at the time, but they trusted me to do so. And understanding why that was important for us to make that next iteration, to get that kiosk at the mall, and continue to do so. So, you know, I didn't have to be a visionary to understand what to build next or the next step iteration to make. I just had to just listen in on, and understand what they were doing. And it's something that, you know, I still struggle with today with our existing membership base, and understanding how we could, you know, grow 10x from our current size. It's, but, you know, going back to our existing customers has always been, you know, the default option, and we can never go wrong when we actually build for them. But I guess it's important to get that first customer too, because if you don't get the first one, you won't be able to get the next one.
So a lot of the stuff that I admire about you, having known you for what, 4 or 5 years now, right, is this scrappiness, right? You talked about calling up a bunch of professors on campus and just hitting the phones. You talked about putting ads out, you know, to see if anybody would call you. You talked about actually talking to customers. So, and a lot of those things, right, are low cost or no cost, right? And I think for students, that's what's really important, right? Is to reiterate that you just have to do it and dive in, and you can do that fairly efficiently. All right. So your last one is fall in love with the process. So talk to me about what process you're talking about and why it's important to fall in love with it.
Yeah, I think it was always the process of building. You know, before Vitable, I've worked on maybe 3 other things that some of them moderately worked out, and others that did not work out at all. But each one was extremely fun for me. I slept most nights at the LaunchBox, although I don't think many other people at the LaunchBox.
No, you napped at the LaunchBox. You never slept at the LaunchBox.
I napped overnight until 6 a.m. at the LaunchBox. But it was that experience where I really loved just building. It became my life. I loved building, launching, you know, talking to users. I'd go to the hub and spend hours just showing people the things I built. It became this addicting thing. And I think that process, you know, whenever, even with Vitable, when we were going through those months when no users were signing up, things just weren't working. I really wanted to build something. You know, I could have taken the job at Microsoft and you know, gone that route, but I was so adamant about building something that I cared about. You know, the worst case would have been I just go and get a job, but I really wanted to make Vitable work, and I just enjoy the process of building. Whereas, you know, I think at times it could be the opposite, where you build for the outcome, but I was never generally concerned about the outcome. I just wanted to hit break even. If I could sustain myself, that would be ideal, and I could do this for the rest of my life. So that process, even though it's painful, it's difficult, I think if you really fall in love with it, and continue to I guess, fall in love with it, you'll never go wrong.
So what's part of the process that you don't like?
I don't like, sometimes I don't like getting on sales calls and getting told no, but I hear it all the time, or I heard it all the time. So that was, you know, that was a part of it, but understanding why they said no was, you know, what would lead us to figure out, you know, how can we better provide value to them.
Okay. So we have some time for some questions. We have a couple questions queued up. So Carrie wants to know, when should I move from one idea to the next? Like, how do I know when to punt, iterate, or keep going?
Yeah, great question. And it just so happens that I spent a year on every idea that I've ever worked on, at least a year. But I think it's different if you haven't launched the product, because if you launch and you're learning for a year, I think a year is a sufficient enough time to know if, you know, the market you're building for, you know, you'll have multiple iterations of that same idea over that year. But, you know, you could learn much faster. You can certainly learn much faster. So if you release a product and you continue to iterate and no one is actually using it, I think you can move on much faster. But having like this, you know, kind of this almost recursive way of getting closer to the truth being, you know, the problem you're solving for your users and the perfect solution for that. I think just having that mental model is important, and it'll vary. But for me, it was always whenever I'd go back to my Microsoft internship, I'd change ideas at the end of the internship. So that was
Yeah.
yeah.
So another question, and I hear this a lot, right? Students are busy. I don't have time, right? So how do you help students find time? Did you believe you were busy as a student based on now running this company? Like help them with time management, and how much time did you spend when you were a student on your idea?
I think it's difficult, but my thought process was I just knew what I wanted to do. My goal had always been at the end of, by the time I graduate, I wanted to have a self-sustaining company that would employ me, not a funded company, just a self-sustaining company. And I was willing to compromise some of my other areas to do so because, going in, I was a physics major and I wanted to go to grad school, and that was the career trajectory. And to do that, I there's things that I needed to meet. But once my sophomore year, once my priorities changed, also I got, once I got the Microsoft internship, it's very hard for you not to get a full-time offer once you get an internship.
Right.
You have to. So that I had that backup plan, which maybe some people don't, and I do understand that would factor in. But I wouldn't say completely ignore your studies, but for me, it was there was a compromise that I made. I wasn't involved in any clubs. Vitable was my any project I worked on was my priority. And with school being, I had to do well, but it was not necessarily my first priority.
Okay, so Janelle wants to know, how did you find people to help you build your vision and your company? Like, what are some tricks or techniques that the students can use to find like-minded teammates?
I was lucky because many of my classmates were engineers, so hackathons were one where I'd go to hackathon and meet other like-minded people who could build. But for the far majority of times, most of the projects I just started working on them myself. No one would join me. I'd ask, hey, anyone want to join me? And they'd all say no. But the more progress I made, the more attractive it became to join me, and I'd always and at that time, people would ask me to join. So even with Vitable, that's what happened. So I've been just, but some people can't do it themselves for multiple reasons. So if finding a co-founder is usually like amazing advice, someone who can complement complement whatever skills that you may or may not have. But if you can't find one, my thought process was just to do, and then
just do it yourself, right? Just keep going. Yeah. Okay. So last time, we have time for probably one more question. So Divya wants to know, what would you have changed about your early startups or your approach?
I don't know. It's hard to look back because there's so much that I still don't know, and will continue to learn. I think I spent a year building on, I look back on, I built this blockchain thing, and we had 14,000 people using it at its peak. And, it was we're running the sales process, selling to companies to use our service to launch their new digital currencies. And, there, we made a strategic mistake where if we hadn't, we would have been much, much bigger and had a more successful outcome than we did. And we didn't do that. And so, there's those little strategic things, but I learned an incredible amount through the process. So I don't know if I would change anything, because I even now, some of the people I'm working with at Vitable that joined us, as the initial employees were people I worked with in those previous projects. So I don't know if there's anything I would change. I would probably continue to learn by doing. Maybe I could have learned faster if I.
Well, yeah. So I think, again, you started relatively early. You were a sophomore when we first met you, right?
Right.
And so that's one of the things I would say is, if you're a student, start now. It's kind of what you said, and you started in the beginning. So we're out of time. I want to thank you, Joe, so much for your time. Anybody out there who's interested in learning more about Joe's company, it's Vitable, Vitable Health. And for those of you who joined in, we welcome your feedback. You can stick it in the Q&A before you leave. Thank you, Joe, again. We really appreciate your time. I'm going to share the next speaker who's coming up. We're having Nick Bayer, who's the founder of Zaxby's, the cafe in Smeal, and he is going to talk about turning business on its head by turning it over to employees and having a mission-based objective. So thank you again for your time, and we hope to see you guys next week.